The desert breathed heat in shimmering waves, a vast expanse of ochre and gold that seemed to stretch into forever. Fine sand whispered against the armored plates of alien patrols as they trudged in formation, their towering frames casting jagged shadows in the midday sun. Above, a pair of black-winged drones cut lazy arcs through the sky, their sensor arrays glinting like tiny stars. Nothing moved out here without the Xyrr Dominion knowing about it. At least, that was what their commanders believed. For 3 months, the alien armies had ruled this world, stamping their claim into every dune, every buried ruin, every scrap of rock. Ardent 5 had once been a small but thriving human colony, its cities clustered along the desert's few life-giving rivers. Now those cities were broken shells, their streets glassed and pitted from orbital strikes. The Xyrr had come for Ethereum, the mineral that pulsed beneath the crust in veins of blue fire, and they had brought with them a war machine as precise and pitiless as the shifting sands. Reeve watched them from a ridge half a kilometer away, invisible beneath layers of burlap-textured mesh and tangled threads the color of sun-scorched dust. His ghillie suit wasn't the crude camouflage of Earth's past wars. Woven with nanofibers, it blurred edges, distorted outlines, and, most importantly, bled heat into the air so slowly that thermal scans registered nothing more than ambient desert warmth. He lay prone, still as a fossilized bone, the butt of his rifle braced firmly into his shoulder, the long barrel nested into a shallow groove he had carved into the sand. Through his scope, he tracked the lead walker as it trudged past a line of alien transports. Its legs were jointed backward like a bird's, each step accompanied by the hiss and sigh of pistons. The alien soldiers, tall, four-armed, plated in armor that caught the light like polished stone, marched with unnerving synchronization. Their faces were hidden behind smooth helms, but Kyle didn't need to see their eyes to know they carried nothing resembling mercy. He had seen what they did to prisoners. The last skirmish had left Kyle stranded here. His unit had been deployed weeks earlier to conduct reconnaissance and disrupt alien supply routes, but an ambush in the canyons had ended that mission before it began. He'd been the only one to crawl out of the wreckage, dragging a rifle and a half-empty pack into the open desert. Since then, he had become part of the landscape, feeding on ration paste, sipping water that tasted faintly of machine oil, sleeping in shallow graves dug under the dunes. His orders were simple now: survive, watch, wait. Patience was his weapon. The Dominion's commanders rotated through the occupation zone like clockwork, each one enforcing their rule with brutal efficiency. And soon, intelligence suggested, a high commander would arrive, a figure whose death might fracture the chain of command and buy the resistance enough breathing room to regroup. Kyle had never been one for politics, but he understood the value of a single, decisive strike. He adjusted the rifle's magnification, sweeping past the patrol to a distant column of dust on the horizon. Too far for details, but he knew the look of military movement, the churn of sand from multiple engines, the slow cohesion of a convoy. Not today, he thought. The High Commander's arrival was still days away. But every moment until then was preparation, every observation a piece of the pattern he would need to exploit. Shifting his focus back to the patrol, Kyle noted how the alien formations adapted to the terrain. They moved in loose lines where dunes rolled high, tightened into columns on flat ground, and always kept the walkers in central positions like mobile fortresses. The drones overhead never strayed far from these units. If he wanted to survive long enough to take a shot, he would need to move like water, finding the gaps, flowing through them before they closed. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint tang of ozone from alien weapons and the gritty scent of disturbed sand. Kyle lowered his cheek to the rifle's stock, breathing slow, counting heartbeats. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then the formation began to veer away, angling toward a distant ridge. Only when it vanished behind it did he let the tension drain from his muscles. He slid backward from his perch, careful to brush away any sign of his presence. His hide was a narrow hollow beneath the lee of a dune, covered with mesh netting weighted down by scattered stones. Inside, it was just big enough for him to lie flat, gear arranged in meticulous order. He unstrapped his canteen, sipped twice, then pulled a small sleigh from his pack. The device hummed faintly as he tapped through recordings, thermal scans, drone flight paths, time-stamped troop rotations. Each file was another tile in the mosaic of the Dominion's presence, and the more complete the picture became, the easier it would be to find the fault line. That was the difference between a random shot and an execution. A shadow passed overhead. Kyle froze. The faint whir of repulsor fans trembled in the air, close enough to stir the netting above his hide. His fingers slid toward the sidearm holstered against his thigh, though he knew it would be useless if the drone had already marked him. But the sound receded, the shadow dissolving into the glare. He exhaled silently and returned to his work. Hours bled together, the sun arcing toward the west, shadows lengthening across the sand. By the time darkness began to pool in the dunes, Kyle had logged another series of observations. A resupply, convoy, 2 scout patrols, and an alien officer pausing to scan the horizon with a device that whined in a pitch just at the edge of hearing. The officer moved on without reacting. Either the tech had failed, or Kyle's suit was doing its job. When the first stars emerged, Kyle crawled from his hide. The desert at night was a different world, cold, silent, and sharp with starlight. He moved low, using the terrain to break lines of sight, his boots leaving faint impressions that the wind would erase by morning. Somewhere to the north, beyond a ridge that loomed like a black wave, he knew there was a comm relay. Alien tech, heavily guarded, but perhaps vulnerable in ways they hadn't considered. He wasn't here to destroy it. Not yet. But if he could get close enough to intercept its transmissions, he might confirm the exact route and schedule for the High Commander's convoy. Every step closer to that knowledge tightened the noose. Kyle paused at the ridge's base, sinking into the shadow it cast. He adjusted his visor, cycling through vision modes until the dark landscape resolved into outlines of heat and motion. 2 sentries stood on the ridge's crest, their elongated rifles slung low. He watched them for long minutes, mapping the rhythm of their patrol. 10 paces to the left. Stop. Scan. 10 paces to the right. Repeat. A memory surfaced unbidden. His brother's laugh, sharp and warm, carried over the crackle of a campfire back on Earth. They had been on leave just before the invasion, talking about fishing trips they'd never take. The memory twisted in his chest, but he forced it down. Sentiment was a luxury that got men killed out here. When the sentries turned away in unison, Kyle began to climb, slow and deliberate. He reached the crest without a sound, belly crawled to the edge, and peered down. The relay stood in a shallow depression, its spire bristling with antennae that pulsed faint blue in the night. 3 more guards circled its base. Not tonight, he reminded himself. Patience. He slid back, descending into darkness until the ridge blocked the relay from view. In the distance, a faint light flickered, a signal from one of his motion sensors buried in the sand near his hide. Something had passed close enough to trigger it. Alien patrol? Wandering scavenger? He didn't know yet, but the prospect stirred an old, familiar edge of anticipation. By the time he returned to his hide, the wind had shifted again, bringing with it a low rumble from far to the east. He crouched at the entrance, scanning the horizon through his scope. There, another column of dust, moving slowly but steadily toward the heart of the occupied zone. Too far for details, but it had the deliberate pace of an official convoy. He smiled faintly, a thin, humorless curve. Soon, the High Commander would come, and when that happened, the desert would remember that it still belonged to those patient enough to wait. The desert was merciless in daylight, but at dawn it was deceptively gentle. Pale light spread across the dunes like spilled milk, softening the jagged ridges into smooth waves. Kyle Reeve moved within that early hush, his steps calculated, his body a shadow, stitched into the earth. Every motion was purposeful, every pause deliberate. His rifle rested across his chest, the long barrel wrapped in strips of tan mesh that fluttered faintly in the morning breeze. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the next rise, a Dominion patrol followed its assigned route. He had tracked their movements for 3 days, learning the cadence of their march, the intervals between their rests, the angle of their scanners. He knew precisely where they would stop and for how long, and in that knowledge lay opportunity. Kyle crawled the final meters to the dune's crest, peering through the sparse veil of his netting. Below, 4 alien soldiers advanced in loose formation. Their armor glimmered in the rising light, segmented plates flexing as they moved. Each carried a long rifle that pulsed faintly with stored energy, the barrels ending in wide, flared muzzles designed for area suppression rather than precision. Hovering just above them was a drone, smaller than the ones he had seen patrolling the skies, but equipped with a spherical sensor pod that swept in slow arcs. He studied them through the scope, adjusting magnification until the faint heat signatures of their bodies resolved clearly against the cooler sand. The patrol was heading toward a shallow basin, a natural choke point surrounded by sloping walls. It was the perfect place for them to stop and the perfect place for him to move. Timing was critical. If the drone passed over him while its sensors were active, the camouflage would not be enough. He waited until it turned toward the far side of the basin, its faint hum receding just slightly before sliding down the dune's leeward slope. The sand gave way under his weight, but his movements were slow enough that the sound was swallowed by the wind. The basin's floor was a mixture of compacted earth and scattered stone, remnants of some ancient riverbed. Kyle kept low, weaving between boulders that offered momentary cover. Through the gaps, he saw the patrol halt. One of the soldiers unclipped a canister from its belt and placed it on the ground. A thin column of steam rose as the device opened, releasing a pale mist that cooled the surrounding air, perhaps to make their rest more bearable in the heat. Kyle's breathing slowed. His target was not all 4 soldiers. Taking the entire patrol would be wasteful and dangerous. But the smallest among them carried a wrist-mounted device with the Dominion's emblem etched into its casing. Kyle had seen such devices before. They were short-range comm relays and data storage units. If he could retrieve it, he might gain access to movement logs or encrypted orders. The patrol conversed in low, throaty tones that barely carried across the basin. Kyle crept closer, each step aligning with the rustle of wind or the scrape of alien boots against stone. He closed the gap until he was just outside the mist's reach. The smaller soldier had turned slightly, its attention fixed on the drone as it hovered above, projecting a faint holographic map into the air. Kyle moved. He lunged from behind the nearest rock, closing the distance in 3 silent strides. His left hand clamped over the alien's mouth plate, while his right drove a knife between the seams of its armor. The soldier spasmed once, then collapsed, its body limp but heavy. Kyle lowered it to the ground, already working to detach the wrist device. The drone's hum changed pitch, sharper now, more alert. Kyle froze. Its sensor pod tilted in his direction, the faint blue light along its edges brightening. He tucked the device into a pouch and dropped flat, pulling the dead soldier's body partially over his own to break the outline of his form. The other 3 soldiers barked something harsh and clipped, their movements suddenly tense. A long moment passed. Then one of them gestured toward the opposite ridge, and the group began moving again, the drone following above. Kyle waited until they had climbed halfway out of the basin before pushing the body off and slipping back into the rocks. His pulse was steady, but the weight of what he now carried pressed against him. The data on the device could change everything, if it held the convoy schedule he hoped for. He retreated along a narrow gully, staying low until the basin and its patrol were out of sight. Only then did he pull the device free. Its interface was alien, a lattice of shifting symbols that reconfigured every few seconds. Kyle tapped the activation stud on his visor, linking its translation software to the device. Lines of text scrolled across his display in pale green, fragmentary at first, then solidifying into coherent entries. Movement logs, supply chains, and there, highlighted in amber, the projected arrival time of the High Commander's convoy. 3 days. The route passed within 2 kilometers of his current position. The wind kicked up, carrying grains of sand that rasped against his visor. Kyle stowed the device, mind already mapping possible sniper positions along that route. He would need height, concealment, and an unobstructed line of sight, and he would need to get there without being tracked by the Dominion's ever-watchful machines. By midday, the sun was a white disk in a bleached sky, and Kyle was deep into the high dunes to the north. Here, the sand formed ridges like frozen waves, their crests sharp enough to cut bare skin. He moved from shadow to shadow, pausing often to scan for drones. Twice, he spotted them far off, black specks against the glare, and each time he lay motionless until they passed. Hours later, he found the place. It was a high ridge with a gradual slope on one side and a sheer drop on the other, overlooking a stretch of flat desert that offered no cover for hundreds of meters in any direction. Perfect for a kill zone. From here, he could see the faint glimmer of the convoy route, a line etched into the earth by the passage of countless treads and skimmers. He marked the coordinates in his visor, then began preparing the ground. He used a collapsible entrenching tool to dig a shallow trench just below the crest, deep enough to conceal his body and rifle without obstructing his view. The sand was dry and loose, but he packed it tightly along the edges, reinforcing it with flat stones scavenged from the slope. Over this, he spread his mesh netting, anchoring it with pebbles that blended seamlessly into the terrain. By the time he finished, the light was fading, painting the desert in shades of amber and violet. He lay in the trench, testing his line of sight through the scope. The route was clearly visible, every ripple of sand sharp in the magnification. The wrist device's data replayed in his mind. 3 days. That was the window. Long enough to refine his shot, short enough to avoid discovery. The Dominion would not expect a lone human to wait in the sand for that long, exposed to the elements and their relentless surveillance. But Kyle was not like most soldiers. He had been trained for this, for the patience that turned hours into weapons. He powered down his visor to conserve energy, letting his eyes adjust to the deepening dark. Above, the stars emerged, bright and cold. Somewhere out there, beyond those points of light, Earth was still under siege, fighting its own desperate battles. He could not help them all, but here, in this stretch of desert, he could tilt the balance. A faint vibration ran through the ground, barely perceptible but growing steadier. Kyle pressed his ear to the sand, listening. Far off, something heavy was moving, perhaps another patrol, perhaps machinery. He stayed still, letting the sound pass through him like wind through a reed. It faded, leaving only the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat. In the silence, he thought of the shot to come. One shot, precise and final, delivered in the blink of an eye, but prepared for over endless days. That was the art of the hunter, and as the desert cooled around him, Kyle felt the familiar stillness settle in his bones, the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be. 3 days. The clock had started. The third day began with a sky the color of cold steel, a thin veil of clouds diffusing the harsh desert light. Kyle Reeve lay in his trench, motionless, the sand molded to the contours of his body. Every muscle was relaxed, every breath shallow. The ridge above him concealed his presence from anyone on the far side, but he still kept his visor's optics at the lowest possible output to avoid even the faintest glimmer that might betray him. Through the scope, the convoy route was a pale scar in the sand, a ribbon of compressed earth stretching into the hazy horizon. For 2 days he had watched it, seeing nothing but scattered patrols and the occasional supply crawler. This was the final morning before the High Commander's arrival, and every part of him was tuned to the moment, like the string of a bow drawn and waiting. He checked the disruptor drone nestled beside him under the netting. Its casing was disguised with sand-colored plating, and its systems were in standby mode. When activated, it would release a targeted pulse capable of destabilizing a small section of the Dominion's energy shields for less than a second. That would be enough. If his aim was perfect, his mind drifted, not in idle thought, but in measured recollection. He remembered the first time he had taken a long-distance shot in combat. Afghanistan, 12 years earlier, lying on a rocky slope in the Hindu Kush, his breath frosting in the air. The target had been a man carrying an encrypted radio, moving between boulders with the confidence of someone who believed distance was safety. One breath in, one breath out, and the man had been gone. The space between then and now felt impossibly wide, yet the sensation was identical, the taut focus, the narrowing of the world to a single point. A faint tremor touched the sand beneath him. He pressed his fingertips into the grit, feeling the vibrations deepen. The sound reached him a moment later, the low, steady rumble of engines. His pulse didn't quicken. He simply shifted his body minutely, angling the scope toward the horizon. They emerged like ghosts through the heat haze, dark shapes resolving into armored skimmers, their underbellies glowing faintly from repulsor fields. Hover tanks followed, their turret-mounted cannons swiveling in slow arcs. The formation was tight, disciplined. Above them, 3 drones moved in perfect triangular alignment, scanning the dunes with methodical sweeps. Kyle's eye caught on the central skimmer, larger than the rest, armored with a dark metal that swallowed sunlight rather than reflecting it. Its sides bore the Dominion's crest, and its canopy was tinted nearly black. Inside, he knew, sat the High Commander. His scope's rangefinder confirmed the distance, 1,876 meters. Well within his weapon's capacity, but too far to account for the shield envelope he could see shimmering faintly around the vehicle. He adjusted the drone's parameters through his visor, watching the targeting reticle blink green. The timing would have to be flawless. He would trigger the disruptor as the skimmer reached a predetermined marker, a jagged outcrop halfway across the kill zone. From there, he would have less than a second to take the shot before the shield reformed. The convoy advanced with mechanical precision. Kyle tracked their movement, adjusting for the gentle crosswind sweeping over the ridge. He tasted dust on his lips, smelled the faint ozone of his weapon's charged rails. The High Commander's skimmer glided closer, the shield distortion rippling like water in sunlight. In the midst of his focus, another vibration reached him, a deeper, sharper thump. He shifted the scope slightly, catching movement on the far edge of the formation. A smaller skimmer had broken from the convoy, speeding toward a cluster of rocks to the south. A scout team, no doubt, checking for threats. If they veered too far, they might spot traces of his nest. He resisted the urge to act. Movement would be riskier than stillness. The scout skimmer paused near the rocks, its mounted sensor array swiveling. Seconds passed. Then it turned and rejoined the convoy. Kyle exhaled slowly through his nose. The outcrop was drawing near. He rolled his shoulders to keep his muscles loose, his breathing controlled and even. The disruptor drone's light pulsed in his periphery, waiting for his command. He thought of his brother, of the message he'd never had the chance to send after the invasion began. They had spoken about hunting as kids, about how patience was the most dangerous thing in the wild. "Let them come to you," his brother had said. Now, the memory was more than comfort. It was instruction. The skimmer entered the marked zone. Kyle's thumb brushed the activation stud. The drone sprang silently to life, rising on a cushion of air no louder than a sigh. It crested the ridge beside him, a small, almost unnoticeable blot against the sky. The pulse fired, an invisible ripple that touched the skimmer's shield, making it flare and dissolve in a burst of blue light. In that instant, Kyle's world narrowed to the scope's reticle. The High Commander's silhouette was faint through the tinted canopy, but the heat signature was clear. He adjusted a fraction for wind drift, let his breath leave him, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's rails discharged with a muted crack, sending a tungsten slug hurtling across the space between them. It was a perfect shot, straight, fast, unstoppable. The slug pierced the canopy, and the heat signature flared, then vanished. Through the scope, Kyle saw the skimmer jerk violently, its repulsors stuttering. The shield snapped back into place, but it was too late. The convoy faltered. Drones darted in erratic patterns, scanning wildly. Hover tanks rotated their turrets toward every direction at once. The High Commander's vehicle listed to one side before dropping heavily into the sand. Kyle pulled back from the scope, already dismantling his rifle into 2 sections for easier transport. The Dominion's response would be immediate and overwhelming. He slid backward through the trench, keeping low until he reached the slope's base. From there, he moved into the shadows of the deeper dunes, following a pre-mapped route toward a fallback hide. The first blast hit the ridge moments later, gouging deep craters into the sand. The sound was a muted roar, dulled by distance, but no less urgent. He kept moving, using the wind's rising howl to mask his steps. Above, the drones streaked in tightening circles, their search patterns converging on his former position. Night was still hours away, and the open desert offered little cover, but Kyle knew how to vanish. His suit blended perfectly into the dune's folds, and he alternated between slow crawls and complete stillness, moving only when the drones turned their sensors elsewhere. The convoy's formation had broken entirely now. The air was thick with alien chatter, sharp and clipped, full of the urgency that comes when control has slipped through your fingers. He reached the mouth of a narrow gully and slid into its shadows. Here, the air was cooler, the wind muted. He crouched behind a boulder, reassembling his rifle with practiced motions. Above him, the sky had taken on the muted gold of late afternoon. He allowed himself one deep breath, the taste of metal and dust mingling on his tongue. Somewhere behind him, the Dominion forces were combing the ridge for his body. They would find nothing but disturbed sand and fragments of stone. The shot had been clean, the withdrawal clean enough to leave them chasing ghosts. Kyle closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment settle. The High Commander was dead. The Dominion's grip on Ardent 5 had been weakened, maybe not broken, but enough to give the Resistance a chance. That was all he had been sent to do. Yet he knew this was not the end. Killing a leader did not end a war. It only shifted its shape. The retaliation would be brutal. Patrols would double. Checkpoints would appear where none had been before, and every shadow in the desert would be suspect. He opened his eyes, scanning the horizon. Already he could feel the shift, like the first breath before a storm. He would need to move again soon, deeper into territory they considered safe. The most dangerous place for him to be was exactly where they would never expect him. For now, though, he remained in the gully, listening to the fading echo of the blasts. The wind began to rise again, lifting fine grains of sand that swirled in golden spirals. In their motion, he saw the truth he had always known. Wars were not won by force alone, but by the patience to wait for the one perfect moment, and the will to act without hesitation when it came. The desert burned under a lowering sun, its light fractured by the dust clouds still drifting over the ridge Kyle had left behind. The echoes of the blast that had killed the High Commander were gone, swallowed by the vast emptiness, but the Dominion's presence had only grown sharper. Drones roved the skies in erratic sweeps, their search grids overlapping, casting shadows that slid across the sand like the strokes of some immense clock counting down to an unseen hour. Kyle kept to the gullies and narrow cuts in the dunes, his rifle broken down and stowed, his movements a careful blend of silence and speed. The comm device, strapped to his wrist, fed him snippets of alien chatter, intercepted through the captured wrist relay. Most of it was disjointed, bursts of commands, location reports, clipped acknowledgments, but the tone was unmistakable. Confusion, agitation. Their formations had fractured, units splitting off to chase phantom sightings. One order repeated more than the rest: secure the corpse. Kyle knew they meant the High Commander's body. That single phrase told him the shot had done more than kill. It had cut through their sense of order. He crested a small dune, dropping into its shadow as a pair of scout skimmers surged past no more than 50 meters away. Their sensor dishes rotated, scanning every crevice, every slope. Kyle pressed himself flat, letting the nanofibers in his suit bleed his heat signature into the sand. The skimmers roared on, their sound dwindling to a hum before vanishing entirely. It would be night soon, and he needed distance. The Dominion would tighten their net as darkness fell, deploying thermal sweeps and motion triangulation. He pushed on, heading toward an abandoned mining tunnel he had scouted days earlier. Its entrance was hidden in the lee of a rock formation, a jagged split in the sandstone barely wide enough to crawl through. Inside, the air would be stale but cool, and the winding shafts would confuse even the most advanced scanners. By the time he reached it, the sky had deepened to a bruised purple, stars winking into view between streaks of cloud. Kyle slid into the crevice, letting the rocks swallow him. The tunnel walls pressed close on either side, the stone rough beneath his gloves. A few meters in, the space widened enough for him to crouch. He unshouldered his pack, setting down the rifle components with quiet precision. The first thing he did was check the data relay again. The alien chatter had thinned, growing more clipped, more desperate. He caught mention of the desert city of Bastion's reach. Dominion Command suspected Resistance forces might have used it as a staging ground. That suspicion would pull units away from the search grid around him. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was a crack in their coverage he could exploit. He set the relay aside, leaning back against the stone. Fatigue pressed down on him now that the adrenaline was fading. In the quiet, his mind returned to the shot. He could still feel the smooth pull of the trigger the moment the world narrowed to the reticle and the target beyond it. There had been no triumph, no thrill, only the cold satisfaction of execution, of fulfilling a task that had demanded patience and precision above all else. He thought of his brother again, not in the sharp pain of loss, but in the steady presence of memory. The conversations they'd had, the long silences they'd shared in deer blinds and on riverbanks. His brother would have understood the discipline it had taken to wait for the perfect shot. He might even have smiled at the thought of a single man changing the course of a battle from nearly 2 kilometers away. The quiet did not last. A distant rumble rolled through the rock, faint but steady. Kyle shifted, crawling to the tunnel's narrow mouth to peer out. Far across the dunes, the glow of repulsor engines lit the horizon, a mass of vehicles moving toward the ridge he had abandoned. They were still combing the kill site, still trying to make sense of an enemy they couldn't see. Kyle slid back into the tunnel. This was his chance to move deeper into the occupied zone, to place himself where his next strike could matter most. Killing the High Commander was only the beginning. The Dominion would name a successor quickly, and that individual would arrive with fresh troops and renewed brutality. The Resistance needed those troops slowed, their supplies sabotaged, their morale chipped away piece by piece. He broke down the next steps in his mind. Reach the low canyons east of Bastion's reach. Reconnect with a Resistance runner who could feed his intel into the broader network, and then vanish again into the dunes. Each move would have to be masked by misdirection. False trails, planted evidence of multiple operatives, and sudden strikes that left no trace but bodies and confusion. Outside, the night thickened. Kyle emerged from the tunnel, moving under the cover of the stars. The desert was alive with wind now, a constant whisper that erased footprints almost as soon as they were made. He kept his pace steady, neither rushing nor lingering, conserving energy for the long haul ahead. In the distance, a flare arced into the sky, burning white before fading. Not a distress signal, too deliberate, too slow. More likely a marker for a patrol sweep. Kyle angled away from it, using a series of low ridges to stay out of sight. Twice, he stopped entirely as drones passed overhead, their sensor pods scanning in smooth, deadly arcs. Hours passed. The wind's song grew deeper, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and scorched sand from the ridge. The Dominion's fury was still burning out there, but their focus was fractured. That was the human advantage. Not strength, not numbers, but the ability to slip through the cracks, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Kyle had reached the edge of the eastern canyons. Jagged cliffs rose from the sand, their shadows stretching long and deep. He descended into the first of them, the air cooling around him. Here, the walls muffled sound, and the sky narrowed to a thin strip overhead. He found a perch halfway up one wall, a shallow alcove that offered concealment and a vantage point over the canyon floor. From here, he could watch the routes the Dominion might use, track their movements, and plan his next strike. He settled in, pulling the mesh netting over himself, blending once more into the stone and sand. The relay crackled softly. A coded human transmission broke through, a voice low and deliberate, speaking the Resistance's secure phrasing. Ghost of Ardent 5, it said, strike confirmed. Impact significant. Awaiting next vector. The name was new to him, but he understood its weight. To them, he was no longer just a soldier in the sand. He was a symbol. He switched the relay off and let the silence return. Symbols were dangerous things. They drew attention, created expectations. But if that attention stayed fixed on him, maybe it would give others the space they needed to rebuild, to push back. The sun climbed, spilling light into the canyon. Kyle closed his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth on his face. He would rest for a few hours, then begin scouting the next kill zone. The Dominion would adapt, but so would he. This was not a battle that would be won in a single shot, but in 1,000 moments of waiting, watching, and striking when the time was right. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the canyons, the Dominion's war machine was already reshaping itself to fill the void left by the High Commander. Ka would be there when its edges cracked again. Patience was not just his weapon. It was the one thing they could never match. And as long as he could wait, the desert would remain his ally.